There are stories veterans don't tell at dinner tables, memories that surface only in the dark hours before dawn, fears so fundamental they reshape a man's relationship with earth, sky, and shadow. This is not clean history. This is not the sanitized version taught in classrooms or commemorated in marble monuments. This is the reconstruction of 5 fears that American veterans of the Vietnam War, specifically those who served between 1968 and 1972, have asked to be remembered and understood. These are the fears that followed them home, that wake them decades later, that made them understand a truth more visceral than any tactical briefing could convey. In Vietnam, there was no safe ground, not in daylight, not in darkness, not above the earth, and certainly not beneath it. The men who fought in Vietnam faced death from enemy fire, of course, but that was almost the simplest fear, the one they'd been trained to expect. The more insidious terrors came from other directions. They came from the coordinates called in by their own forward observers, from the grid squares where American artillery would thunder down with catastrophic precision or catastrophic error. They came from the possibility of being left behind in hostile territory, of watching the last helicopter lift away while you ran toward it through elephant grass. They came from the jungle itself, which didn't care which uniform you wore as it rotted your feet, filled your blood with parasites, and hid death in every shadow. They came from beneath the ground, where an entire enemy infrastructure existed in darkness, where tunnel openings could appear beneath your boots at any moment. And they came from inside supposedly secure bases, where sappers could materialize out of the night, where rockets could arc in during breakfast, where the man fixing your generator might be counting your ammunition stores for the Viet Cong. The temporal and geographical context matters profoundly. The period from 1968 to 1972 represented some of the war's bloodiest and most psychologically devastating years. The Tet Offensive of early 1968 had shattered any illusion of impending victory. The expansion into Cambodia in 1970 and the intensification of operations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail meant American units were operating deeper in hostile territory, farther from support, closer to the edge of sustainability. This was also the era of Vietnamization, when American forces were simultaneously being asked to maintain pressure on enemy forces while beginning the long demoralizing process of withdrawal. Morale was deteriorating. Drug use was climbing. Fragging incidents, where enlisted men killed their own officers with fragmentation grenades, were becoming more common. This was a war that was being lost in the minds and hearts of those fighting it, even as tactical victories continued to be claimed. The geographical reality was equally unforgiving. Along the DMZ near the 17th parallel, fire-based positions like those around Khe Sanh existed under constant artillery threat from North Vietnamese guns positioned in the hills. The A Shao Valley, a narrow corridor running parallel to the Laotian border, was a NVA stronghold where the jungle grew so thick that entire battalions could move beneath the canopy unseen by aerial observation. Further south, the central highlands around Pleiku and Kontum saw some of the war's most intense fighting, with American forces from the 4th Infantry Division and the 101st Airborne Division conducting search and destroy missions in mountainous terrain, where visibility was measured in meters and ambushes were a daily reality. Along the Cambodian border west of Saigon, units like the 25th Infantry Division and the 1st Cavalry Division operated in mixed terrain of rubber plantations, dense jungle, and the infamous Cu Chi tunnel complex, where the enemy literally lived beneath American boot soles. And in the Mekong Delta, the U.S. Navy's brown water forces patrolled endless waterways where the distinction between civilian and combatant blurred into nothing, where every sampan might carry weapons, where leeches and disease were as deadly as any ambush. The men who served in these regions came from identifiable units with distinct cultures and missions. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, specialized in airmobile operations, inserting troops by helicopter into landing zones that were often actively contested. These were young men, mostly 19 to 22 years old, whose reflexes were fast, but whose experience was dangerously thin. They carried M16A1 rifles that were prone to jamming in the mud and humidity, claymore mines for perimeter defense, smoke grenades for marking positions, and malaria prophylaxis pills that many stopped taking because the side effects seemed worse than the risk. They served as point men, the lead soldier in a patrol whose job was to be the first to trigger an ambush or step on a mine, and as flank security, watching the sides while everyone else watched forward, always knowing that in Vietnam, the killing shot often came from the periphery. The Marines of the 1st Marine Division, operating primarily in I Corps in the northern provinces, had a reputation for toughness that was both deserved and burdensome. They were expected to endure more, complain less, and maintain combat effectiveness under conditions that would break other units. Many were veterans of multiple firefights, their faces perpetually gaunt from recurring malaria, their eyes hollowed by chronic sleep deprivation. They often preferred the older M14 rifle or even shotguns for jungle work, carried the PRC-25 radio that was both lifeline and target, and humped illumination rounds and extra batteries. They were the ones other units called when a position was being overrun, when a patrol was pinned down, when someone needed to hold ground no matter the cost. Then there were the Special Operations Forces, the men who wore no unit patches and whose missions weren't discussed in official briefings. MACV SOG, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, ran covert operations deep into Laos and Cambodia, technically neutral countries where American ground forces were officially forbidden. These were small teams, 4 to 6 men, lean and hyper-alert, who moved through enemy territory for days at a time with no expectation of immediate support. They carried CAR-15 carbines, the shortened version of the M16, along with foreign weapons scavenged or stolen to confuse the enemy about who was operating in their backyard. They studied maps of terrain that officially didn't exist, marked trails that weren't on any chart, and lived with the understanding that stealth was survival. If they were compromised, if the noise of contact echoed through the jungle, their only option was immediate extraction or a running retreat toward a border they'd already crossed illegally. And finally, there were the brown water Navy sailors, the men who crewed patrol boats and monitors on the rivers and canals of the Delta. They operated in a world of brown water and green jungle walls, where channels twisted endlessly, where the sunlight rarely penetrated the canopy, where ambushes came from both banks simultaneously. They manned M60 machine guns on exposed mounts, carried light flares and life preservers, and knew that if their boat was hit and sinking, the water itself was a threat filled with crocodiles, leeches the size of your thumb, and an enemy who could swim and shoot simultaneously. These were the actors in a drama defined by fear, and the first fear, the one that violated the most fundamental trust of military service, was the fear of friendly fire. The American military in Vietnam possessed overwhelming firepower. Artillery batteries could drop dozens of shells on target within minutes. Fighter bombers could deliver napalm, cluster bombs, and high-explosive ordnance with devastating precision. B-52 bombers flying so high they couldn't be seen or heard could carpet an area the size of several football fields with bombs, obliterating everything within the target box. The problem was not the power of these weapons. The problem was ensuring they fell on the enemy and not on you. Forward observers, the FOs, were young officers or NCOs whose job was to call in artillery fire. They worked with map coordinates, compass bearings, and distance estimates, translating the chaos of combat into precise grid numbers that would be radioed back to gun batteries miles away. A single transposed digit, a misread map sheet edge, a momentary confusion between magnetic and true north could shift the impact point by hundreds of meters. When you were calling in fire danger close, when the enemy was so near that the artillery would land within the defined safety margin of your own position, the mathematics of survival became terrifyingly simple. One small error and American shells would arrive like the wrath of God upon American soldiers. It happened near the DMZ on a night when fog rolled in so thick that visibility dropped to arm's length. A Marine FO was calling in 105 mm of fire on suspected NVA positions. The rounds were walking closer, each volley adjusted based on his observations, but the wind shifted, the fog distorted sound. The shells, already dancing on the edge of being too close, fell short. The screaming started immediately, not the screaming of incoming, but the screaming of men being torn apart by their own artillery. Shrapnel doesn't ask which side you're on. White phosphorus doesn't check your uniform before it burns through flesh. The FO who called that mission carried it for the rest of his life. In his mind, he had killed his own men. That's what friendly fire does. It transforms you from warrior to executioner of your brothers. Or consider the 101st Airborne Company operating near A Shao Valley, calling in fire on a hillside where they'd taken contact. The terrain was almost vertical, covered in triple canopied jungle, with no clear lines of sight. The artillery was adjusted again, walking up the slope toward the enemy position. But the map was wrong. The maps in Vietnam were often wrong, based on French surveys from decades earlier, showing hills that had eroded and valleys that had shifted. The shells cleared the hilltop and came down the other side, where another American platoon was advancing. The casualties were immediate and horrific. Men were killed not by enemy action, but by a map that lied and coordinates that were technically correct, but tactically lethal. The PRC-25 radio was the technological lifeline of small units in Vietnam, a backpack-sized FM transceiver that could reach helicopters, artillery, and higher command. It was also temperamental. Humid, air-shorted connections. Batteries died. Antennas snapped during movements through thick brush. And the terrain itself was an enemy to radio waves. Mountains blocked signals. Dense vegetation absorbed them. In valleys, you could be screaming into the handset and no one would hear you. This created a nightmare scenario. Artillery missions called in, and then, when they needed to be adjusted or canceled, the radio failed. The shells kept coming because no one could tell them to stop. RTO operators, the radio telephone operators who humped the PRC-25, lived with a unique burden. They were specifically targeted by enemy snipers who knew that killing the radio meant isolating the unit. But they were also potentially the most dangerous person in the squad to their own men, because if they miscommunicated coordinates or lost contact at the wrong moment, friendly fire would rain down with no way to stop it. Then there was close air support, the KAS missions, where fighter bombers would scream in low, over-contested positions to deliver ordnance. F-4 Phantoms and F-100 Super Sabres carrying napalm were particularly feared by both sides. Napalm, jellied gasoline that stuck to everything and burned at temperatures that could melt steel, was devastatingly effective against jungle positions. It was also utterly uncontrollable once released. If the pilot's approach angle was slightly off, if wind caught the tumbling canisters, if the terrain sloped unexpectedly, the napalm could roll downhill or splash back toward friendly positions. Veterans describe the sound of men burning from napalm as something fundamentally different from other combat sounds, a keening that contained more animal than human, a noise that drilled into your skull and never left. Some men who survived being hit by American napalm wished they hadn't. The burns were so severe, so total, that survival meant decades of surgeries and pain. B-52 strikes, officially designated Arc Light missions, were the ultimate expression of American firepower. Flying at altitudes above 30,000 feet, the bombers were invisible and inaudible until the bombs hit. Each B-52 could carry dozens of bombs, and they flew in cells of 3, creating a devastated strip kilometers long. The psychological effect was enormous. Even if you were miles away, you felt the ground shudder, heard the rolling thunder of explosions, and understood that beneath that sky nothing survived. But B-52 strikes were planned at high levels, based on intelligence that was often outdated by the time the bombers arrived. Special operations teams working near the Ho Chi Minh Trail or in the border regions sometimes found themselves uncomfortably close to planned arc light boxes. The protocol was to be outside the box before the strike time. But missions ran long, extractions got delayed, coordinates got confused, and suddenly you were counting minutes and hoping the intelligence officers back in Saigon had plotted the boxes correctly. And then there was fragging, the ultimate betrayal of military cohesion, the murder of officers and NCOs by their own men. The term came from fragmentation grenades, the M26 and M67, which were the weapons of choice because they were anonymous. A grenade rolled into a hooch or bunker could have come from anywhere. There were no ballistics, no rifling marks, nothing to trace it back to a specific thrower. Fragging incidents increased dramatically between 1969 and 1972 as morale collapsed, as the purpose of the war became increasingly unclear, as men were being ordered to take hills that would be abandoned days later, to conduct patrols for no discernible objective other than to make contact and produce body counts. Officers who pushed too hard, who volunteered their units for dangerous missions to advance their own careers, who seemed indifferent to casualties, became targets. So did NCOs who enforced discipline too rigidly or who were suspected of racial bias in an increasingly diverse and divided force. The mechanics of fragging were simple and terrible. Wait until night. Wait until the target is asleep or distracted. Pull the pin, release the spoon, count to 2, and throw. Then confusion, shouts, someone thinking it was incoming enemy ordnance. By the time anyone realized it was a fragmentation grenade from American stocks, the thrower was just another soldier responding to the chaos. Investigations were difficult because no one talked. The conspiracy of silence was absolute because everyone understood that fragging represented a breaking point, a moment when the social contract of military service had shattered. Officers began sleeping in different places each night. Some wore flak vests in their own bunkers. The fear wasn't just of the enemy anymore. It was of the private who'd been on one too many pointless patrols, the specialist who'd seen one too many friends die for terrain that didn't matter, the corporal who decided that survival required eliminating the lieutenant who kept volunteering them for missions. This brings us to the second fear, the terror of being left behind, of being overrun, of being captured. Firebase defenders understood this fear intimately. A firebase was theoretically a position of strength, a fortified hilltop or clearing with artillery, mortars, bunkers, perimeter wire, claymore mines, and interlocking fields of fire. In practice, many firebases were desperately vulnerable, particularly those positioned in remote areas to provide fire support for operations along the borders. Firebase Ripcord, near the A Shau Valley, was under such constant attack in 1970 that resupply helicopters were hit almost every time they approached. The defenders knew they were holding ground that couldn't be held indefinitely, that sooner or later the enemy would mass enough forces for a final assault. The nightmare scenario played out at several fire bases during major enemy offensives. Artillery and mortar fire would begin at dusk, softening the perimeter, destroying defensive positions, cutting communication wire. Then, in the darkness, the assault would come. Not a few sappers, but waves of infantry, NVA regulars moving with discipline and determination, accepting casualties that would break most units, but continuing forward. The defenders would fire until M60 barrels glowed red, until M16 rifles jammed from overheating, until the pile of empty brass was ankle deep. They would throw grenades, detonate claymore mines, call in artillery on their own perimeter coordinates, anything to stop the advance, and all the while a question burned in every mind. How much ammunition is left? The answer was never reassuring. Resupply by helicopter was difficult during day and nearly impossible during sustained assault. If you ran dry and the enemy was still coming, your options narrowed to melee combat with bayonets and entrenching tools, or surrender. The question that haunted every firebase defender was what happened if they were overrun while still alive. Being killed in combat was one thing. Being wounded and conscious while the firebase fell was another entirely. The NVA and Viet Cong took prisoners, but the journey to a prisoner of war camp meant being marched north, often for weeks, through jungle and mountains, wounded and without medical care. Many didn't survive the march. Those who did faced years in camps where torture was systematic, where psychological pressure was unrelenting, where food and medical care were minimal. The Hanoi Hilton Hoa Lo prison in North Vietnam became notorious among pilots who were shot down, but ground troops captured in the South faced an equally grim prospect of being moved through Laos or Cambodia toward North Vietnamese prison facilities. Long-range reconnaissance patrols and SOG teams lived with this fear as a constant companion. A typical SOG mission might insert a team of 6 men 30 kilometers inside Laos, near a suspected section of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, with orders to observe enemy movements for 72 hours. The insertion would be by helicopter into a cleared landing zone, a few frantic seconds of vulnerability as the chopper hovered and men jumped out. Then the rotor wash and engine noise would fade, and suddenly the team would be alone in enemy territory. If they were discovered, if local forces tracked them, if they had to break silence and call for extraction, everything depended on helicopters being able to reach them. But weather could scrub helicopter missions. Enemy anti-aircraft fire could drive the birds away. Mechanical failures could strand a team that was expecting pickup in minutes. The radio operator on such missions carried a weight beyond the physical pounds of the PRC-25. He was the voice that connected the team to salvation, the link to artillery support, to helicopter extraction, to any hope of survival if things went wrong. He also knew that if the team was cornered, if extraction was impossible, if they were about to be captured, he would be expected to destroy the radio and the code materials. Some SOG operators carried an extra magazine loaded with tracer rounds, not for signaling, but for destroying equipment quickly. And many carried one additional item, rarely discussed officially, but widely understood: a final bullet. The mindset was clear. Capture meant torture, interrogation, possible execution, or years in a camp from which you might never return. For some men, the decision was made in advance. If it came to that, if there was no way out, the last round would be for themselves. The fear wasn't only personal. It was existential in a broader sense. The knowledge that disappearing in the jungle meant your family would receive not a death notification, but a missing in action classification. MIA status was a kind of purgatory, a bureaucratic limbo that offered no closure, no ability to mourn and move forward. Families of MIA soldiers lived for years, sometimes decades, hoping for information that rarely came, unable to accept death because it wasn't confirmed, unable to believe in life because no evidence suggested it. For the soldiers themselves, the idea of vanishing, of becoming a name on a list rather than a body returned home, was in some ways worse than dying in a way that could be verified and honored. Helicopter crews, the pilots and door gunners of medevac and extraction birds, carried their own nightmares about leaving men behind. Dust-off missions, the medical evacuations under fire, were some of the most dangerous flights of the war. A UH-1 Huey helicopter, loaded with wounded, was heavy, slow to climb, and vulnerable to ground fire. Landing in a hot LZ, a landing zone under active enemy fire, meant setting down in a space where enemy machine guns and RPGs were trying to kill you. The pilots had seconds to assess whether they could get in and out. Sometimes the decision was made for them when the aircraft took hits to critical systems. Engine failure or rotor damage meant crash landing or fighting to gain enough altitude to reach safer ground. And sometimes that meant leaving behind men who were running toward the helicopter, who had made it through the firefight only to watch their ride home lift away without them. Those images, a pilot later said, never fade. You see them in mirrors, in reflections, in the moment before sleep. The man running, arm outstretched, falling behind as the helicopter claws for altitude, his face in that last second before you clear the trees. The third fear arose not from human enemy, but from the environment itself, from the jungle that covered much of Vietnam's contested regions. The jungle was its own combatant, neutral in allegiance but lethal in effect, as dangerous to Americans as to the Viet Cong, perhaps more so because Americans hadn't grown up learning its rhythms and dangers. Every branch could hide a snake. Every vine could harbor insects whose bites caused agony or death. Every water source could carry disease. Every footstep could sink into rot or mud that would pull you down. The jungle killed slowly, rotting feet, filling blood with parasites, driving men mad with exhaustion and constant low-level pain. Snakes were everywhere. Bamboo pit vipers, green and small, lived in branches at head height. Malayan pit vipers, thick-bodied and aggressive, occupied the ground level. Cobras and kraits, both neurotoxic and deadly, moved through grass and undergrowth. Soldiers on patrol understood that every time they grabbed a tree trunk for balance, pushed through hanging vegetation, or sat down to rest, they were gambling. The mathematics were cruel. Most of the time, nothing happened. But it only took once, and a snake bite in the field meant a medevac if radio worked and help was available, or a slow death from venom or secondary infection if not. The deeper nightmare was being bitten at night during an ambush position or listening post, when silence was survival. Cry out and you compromise the entire unit's position. Stay silent, and the venom worked through your system while you endured waves of pain and nausea. Some men chose silence and died doing it. Centipedes in Vietnam could grow to 30 centimeters, with a bite that caused swelling and pain for days. Scorpions nested in boots, left outside at night, in uniforms hung to dry, in sleeping bags. Fire ants, tiny and vicious, boiled out of disturbed nests to cover a man's legs and arms, each bite a point of burning pain that welded into a continuous agony. Leeches were a constant presence in wet areas, thin as threads when they attached, but swelling to the size of fingers as they fed, requiring careful removal because pulling them off often left the mouth parts embedded to cause infection. The jungle was a machine for causing discomfort and pain, and that pain was tactical. LRRP teams and reconnaissance units found that the presence of insects and snakes limited how long men could remain motionless in observation. A soldier could endure enemy patrols passing nearby, could control his breathing and remain frozen. But when centipedes crawled across his face or ants found their way into his clothing, when a snake coiled near his hand, the instinct to move became overwhelming. Missions were cut short, not by enemy action, but by the simple inability to remain still while the jungle inflicted 1,000 small tortures. Disease was perhaps the jungle's most effective weapon. Malaria was endemic throughout Vietnam, particularly in the border regions, the central highlands, and the Mekong Delta. More than 80,000 cases were reported during the war, and many more went unreported because men feared being removed from their units or losing respect for something that seemed preventable. The reality was that prevention was difficult. Mosquito repellent helped, but wasn't perfect. Netting was issued but often impractical when trying to move quietly. Prophylactic medications like chloroquine or mefloquine had side effects that some found intolerable, vivid nightmares and nausea that made men question whether the cure was worse than the disease. So some stopped taking the pills and rolled the dice. When malaria hit, it hit hard. A man could be healthy in the morning and by afternoon be shaking with fever, barely able to stand, his body temperature spiking to dangerous levels. In a fire base with medical personnel, this meant treatment and evacuation. On patrol, it meant becoming a burden, someone who needed to be carried or supported while the unit's pace slowed to accommodate a soldier who was now more liability than asset. Dengue fever, Japanese encephalitis, and various parasitic infections added to the disease burden. There was no vaccine for dengue, and the pain it caused earned it the nickname break bone fever, because the joint and muscle pain felt like bones were being crushed from inside. Encephalitis could cause permanent brain damage. Parasites entered through food, water, or skin contact with contaminated soil. The cumulative effect was that every unit operating in the field for extended periods would see a steady attrition of combat-effective personnel, not from enemy action, but from disease. Platoons that should have had 40 men might operate with 30, because the rest were in aid stations with fevers or infections. Immersion, foot, and jungle rot were the signature injuries of the ground war in Vietnam. The Mekong Delta, the lowland rice paddies, the rivers and streams that crisscrossed the country meant that soldiers often spent days with wet feet. Canvas jungle boots would fill with water and stay wet. The skin would soften, then crack, then begin to peel away in sheets. Fungal infections would take hold, eating into tissue, causing pain with every step. The standard treatment was to dry out the feet, apply antifungal powder, and rest. But operations didn't stop for foot care. Men were expected to keep walking, to keep patrolling, to keep performing their mission, even when every step felt like walking on exposed nerves. Some lost toenails. Some developed infections so severe the bone was affected, requiring evacuation and surgery. And some simply endured day after day, knowing that complaining wouldn't change anything and that everyone else was suffering similarly. The fourth fear took the ground beneath your feet, the one thing that should be solid and reliable, and made it treacherous. The Cu Chi tunnels were the most famous example, but they represented only a fraction of an extensive underground infrastructure that the Viet Cong and NVA had developed over years of fighting, first against the French and then against the Americans and South Vietnamese. These were not crude holes in the ground, but engineered complexes with multiple levels, ventilation systems, hospitals, storage chambers, command centers, and living quarters. Some tunnels extended for kilometers, connecting entire regions, with entrances disguised so perfectly that soldiers could walk past them repeatedly without noticing. The tunnels existed under American bases, under villages declared pacified, under roads and trails that were used daily. The ground was not neutral. The ground hid armies. The psychological impact of this reality was profound. Soldiers of the 25th Infantry Division, whose base camp at Cu Chi was literally built on top of major tunnel networks, understood that the enemy wasn't just in front of them in the tree line, but potentially beneath them at any moment. Patrols would capture enemy soldiers and wonder how they'd gotten so close to the American perimeter without being seen. The answer was often that they'd traveled underground, emerging from spider holes and concealed entrances only when they were already inside the supposedly secure area. The term spider hole refers to small camouflaged fighting positions just large enough for one person, with a lid that closed flush with the ground. A soldier could stand on top of one and never know it. The fighter inside would wait until the patrol passed, then open the lid, fire from behind at point-blank range, and drop back underground before return fire arrived. The Americans would shoot at nothing, at ground that had swallowed the enemy. Searching for tunnels was painstaking and dangerous work. Engineers would probe the ground with metal rods, looking for the hollow sound that indicated a cavity below. Sometimes they'd find entrances, square holes barely large enough for a slender person to slip through, often hidden under pots or furniture in village houses, or concealed in the banks of streams and rice paddies. The discovery of a tunnel entrance created a dilemma. It needed to be explored to understand where it went, what it contained, whether it connected to other positions. But entering a tunnel was volunteering for a descent into nightmare. Tunnel rats were specialists, usually small-statured men who could fit through passages that averaged less than a meter high and wide. They'd strip off their gear, leave behind rifles that were too long for the cramped spaces, and descend with just a pistol, a flashlight, and sometimes a knife. The conditions inside were beyond claustrophobic. The air was stale and thick, smelling of earth and human waste and decay. The darkness was absolute when the flashlight failed. The tunnels twisted, branched, rose and fell, creating a three-dimensional maze where direction became meaningless. And somewhere in that maze were enemy fighters who knew every turn, who could move in the darkness without light, who had booby-trapped sections and prepared firing positions. The combat that occurred in tunnels was unlike anything else in the war. The distances were measured in meters, sometimes just arm's length. If you encountered an enemy coming the other direction, there was no cover, no room to maneuver, just two men in a space barely larger than a coffin, one of whom would die. Pistol fire in a confined space was deafening and blinding, the muzzle flash destroying night vision, the report echoing until you couldn't tell if other shots were following or if it was just echoes. Sometimes it came down to knives, to grappling in the dark, to desperate hand-to-hand fighting where you couldn't see the man you were trying to kill, but could feel his breath and his blood and his body going limp, or not, depending on who'd been faster or luckier. The Americans used various methods to neutralize tunnels. CS gas was pumped in, hoping to force defenders to surface or kill them with exposure. Smoke was used to find alternate entrances by watching where it emerged. Explosives were placed to collapse sections. The most extreme method was the tunnel denial operation, where large amounts of explosives would be placed at multiple points, and the entire complex would be destroyed. But even after destruction, there was never certainty that all the tunnels had been found, that new ones wouldn't be dug, that the ground had been made safe. And for the tunnel rats who'd gone down into that darkness, the psychological scars were permanent. Many developed claustrophobia that lasted decades, an inability to tolerate elevators, basements, or any enclosed space that triggered memories of Earth pressing in from all sides and enemies waiting in the dark. The fifth fear was the realization that even designated safe zones, even fire bases and major bases, were not truly secure. This fear had multiple sources, from external attack to internal betrayal. Sappers, the elite NVA and Viet Cong commandos specialized in infiltration, were ghosts who moved through defensive perimeters that should have been impenetrable. They'd spend hours, sometimes entire nights, crawling through wire obstacles, mud-covered and nearly naked, to reduce noise and detection, carrying satchel charges and explosives. Their targets were aircraft, fuel dumps, ammunition stores, and command bunkers. A successful sapper attack could destroy millions of dollars in equipment and kill dozens of personnel, and the psychological impact was even greater than the physical damage. If the enemy could get inside the wire, inside the perimeter, then nowhere was safe. Rocket and mortar attacks on major bases were routine enough to have a grim predictability. Bien Hoa Air Base, Da Nang, Pleiku, Chu Lai, all the major installations took regular incoming fire from 122 millimeters and 107 millimeter rockets and 82 millimeter or 120 millimeter mortars. The attacks usually came at night or during dawn, and the warning was minimal. The sound of the first impact was often the first indication that a barrage had started. Men would scramble for bunkers, throwing on flak jackets and helmets, never knowing if the next round would hit their position. The randomness was maddening. You could be eating breakfast when a rocket hit the mess hall. You could be in the latrine when mortar rounds walked across the compound. You could be sleeping when your hooch took a direct hit. There was no correlation between behavior and survival. It was pure chance, and that's a difficult framework for human minds to accept. Insider attacks added another layer of mistrust. Vietnamese civilians worked on American bases as laborers, cooks, laundry workers, and maintenance personnel. ARVN soldiers Army of the Republic of Vietnam forces worked alongside Americans as allies, but infiltration was always a possibility. Some workers were Viet Cong sympathizers, gathering intelligence and reporting on American strength and dispositions. Some ARVN soldiers had divided loyalties or were under threat from Viet Cong who threatened their families, and occasionally this led to violence inside the wire. There were incidents of workers attacking soldiers, of ARVN troops firing on Americans, of people trusted as friendly revealing themselves as enemies. The result was a corrosive suspicion that made genuine cooperation more difficult, that forced Americans to question whether the smiling cook or the friendly interpreter or the ARVN liaison officer might be the one counting ammunition stores or mapping bunker locations for the enemy. Fire-based sieges combined all these elements into sustained agony. Fire bases like Ripcord or the smaller outposts along the border with Laos would sometimes face days or weeks of constant pressure. Artillery and mortar fire would come in waves, destroying fighting positions that had to be rebuilt under fire. Ground probes would test the perimeter nightly, trying to find weak points. Resupply became increasingly difficult as helicopters took fire on approach. Medical evacuation of the wounded was delayed by weather or by the intensity of anti-aircraft fire around the landing zone. And the defenders, exhausted from lack of sleep, from constant alert status, from the grinding stress of being under fire with no ability to strike back effectively, would begin to wonder if this was the time the fire base would be overrun, if this was when the final assault would come, and they would have to fight hand-to-hand in the bunkers, or retreat to a final perimeter that would become their gravesite. This brings the narrative full circle to where it began, to the central understanding that there was no safe ground in Vietnam. The 5 fears were not discrete categories, but overlapping realities that reinforced each other. Friendly fire meant you couldn't trust your own support. The possibility of being left behind or captured meant extraction was never guaranteed. The environment and disease were constant drains on strength and morale. The ground beneath your feet might hide enemies. And even in rear areas and established bases, death could arrive without warning. Together, these created a psychological environment where hypervigilance was required for survival, but where hypervigilance itself caused damage to mental health and unit cohesion. The war didn't end when the soldiers came home. Post-traumatic stress disorder, though not yet formally defined by that term during the Vietnam era, was epidemic among returnees. The symptoms matched perfectly with the fears they'd lived through. Fireworks sounded like rockets and triggered diving for cover. Crowded spaces and inability to see exits caused panic. Humid weather and enclosed spaces brought back the jungle and the tunnels. Sleep was difficult because sleep required vulnerability, and vulnerability had been trained out of them. The startle reflex was hair trigger, remaining on combat alert decades after the threat had passed. And the memories, the specific images of friends dying from friendly fire, of helicopters leaving without them, of disease and rot, of darkness underground, of rockets hitting the bunker next door, these memories didn't fade. They were burned in, permanent installations in the architecture of consciousness. The number 58,000 represents the American dead, the names on the wall in Washington, but that number doesn't capture the totality of damage. It doesn't count the hundreds of thousands who returned physically intact, but psychologically shattered, who spent the rest of their lives managing fear responses to stimuli that other people barely noticed, who struggled with relationships and employment, and the simple act of existing in a peaceful society that had no framework for understanding what they'd endured. The war killed more than 58,000. It damaged generations, families, communities, and a national psyche that still hasn't fully processed what happened in the jungles and rice paddies and tunnels of Vietnam between 1968 and 1972. Understanding these 5 fears, reconstructing them with specificity and honesty, is not about glorifying war or condemning those who fought. It's about bearing witness to a truth that the participants themselves have asked to be remembered. They want it understood that they fought not just an enemy, but an environment, a geography, a reality that attacked from every direction, including from within their own forces. They want it known that courage in Vietnam often meant simply continuing to function while everything, the ground, the air, the support systems, the command structure, proved unreliable. They want the complexity acknowledged, the moral ambiguity faced, the impossible choices made under conditions of incomplete information and existential threat. This is their testimony, filtered through time and trauma, asking only that we remember the truth of what fear looked like when there was no safe ground anywhere in an entire country.